April 16th, 1945. Radar Picket Station One, 50 miles north of Okinawa. Seaman First Class Robert Johnson gripped the handles of his 20mm Oerlikon cannon and watched the western horizon turn black with aircraft. 32 Japanese planes, 1 American destroyer. 80 minutes until sunset. His commanding officer had just given an order that made his blood run cold. "All hands, prepare to be boarded or sunk. We will not withdraw." This is the story of the USS Laffey, the ship that refused to perish, and the gun crew that broke every rule in the Navy manual to save it. The Laffey was not supposed to be alone. Destroyer Number 7. 2-4, a Sumner-class destroyer commissioned just 11 months earlier, had been assigned to radar Picket Station One as part of a defensive screen protecting the invasion fleet at Okinawa. The picket stations formed an early warning network positioned between the main fleet and the Japanese home islands. Ships stationed there were sitting ducks, deliberately exposed to draw enemy attacks and provide advance warning of incoming raids. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton, the Laffey's commanding officer, understood the mathematics of his situation perfectly. His ship displaced 3,200 tons, measured 376 feet from bow to stern, and carried a crew of 336 men. Against the combined might of the Japanese 4th Air Army and 5th Air Fleet, those numbers meant nothing. What mattered was firepower, training, and the willingness of his crew to fight when survival seemed impossible. The Laffey mounted 6 5-inch 38-caliber dual-purpose guns in 3 twin turrets, 12 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns in twin and quad mounts, and 11 20mm Oerlikon cannons positioned around the superstructure. On paper, this represented one of the most heavily armed destroyer configurations in the U.S. Navy. In practice, Commander Beckton knew that no amount of firepower could stop what was coming. The Japanese High Command had designated April 16th as Kikusui No. 6, the 6th mass kamikaze operation of the Okinawa campaign. Intelligence estimates suggested between 150 and 200 aircraft would participate. Their primary targets were the exposed radar picket destroyers like Laffey, ships that could not run, could not hide, and could expect no immediate support. At 7:44 in the morning, the Laffey's SK air search radar detected the first bogies, bearing 270 degrees, range 60 miles, speed 180 knots. Commander Beckton studied the radar scope and made his calculations. At current closure rate, the Japanese would reach his position in approximately 20 minutes. He ordered general quarters. Throughout the ship, men scrambled to battle stations they had drilled at hundreds of times but never truly expected to use in combat like this. Gun crews charged their weapons. Damage control parties positioned themselves near critical compartments. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Matthew Darnell, prepared the wardroom for casualties, laying out instruments with hands that did not yet shake. On the aft 20mm gun platform, Seaman First Class Robert Johnson and his gun crew, Seaman Owen Ratter, Seaman Lawrence Delowski, and gunner's mate 3rd Class Calvin Clower, went through their pre-combat checklist with mechanical precision. Check ammunition feed, verify hydraulic pressure, test elevation and traverse mechanisms, clear barrel obstructions. Each man knew his role. Johnson was the pointer, controlling elevation and triggering fire. Ratter was the trainer, controlling traverse. Delowski and Clower were loaders, responsible for changing the 60-round drum magazines that fed the Oerlikon's voracious appetite for ammunition. What happened to Johnson and his crew that morning represents the experience of dozens of gun crews across the Laffey, each one facing the same impossible odds, each one making the same decision to stand and fight when survival meant running. Johnson's story is not unique to him alone. It is the story of every sailor at every gun position who refused to abandon their post during those 80 minutes of hell. His name stands for all of them. The 20mm Oerlikon was a Swiss-designed weapon that had become the backbone of American close-range anti-aircraft defense. It fired a 20mm high-explosive incendiary shell at a rate of 450 rounds per minute, with an effective range of roughly 1,000 yards. The shells were not large enough to reliably destroy an aircraft with a single hit, but the volume of fire was devastating. A skilled crew could put 90 rounds into a target in 12 seconds, creating a wall of exploding projectiles that could shred aluminum airframes and neutralize enemy pilots. But the Oerlikon had a fatal weakness: no armor protection. The gunner stood completely exposed, operating the weapon with his body pressed against the gun mount, his face inches from the breech. In kamikaze attacks, where enemy aircraft deliberately targeted gun positions, operating a 20mm mount was essentially volunteering for elimination. The survival rate for Oerlikon crews in sustained kamikaze attacks was less than 40%. Johnson knew the statistics. Every man on that gun platform knew them. They had discussed it during the previous night's watch, speaking in the careful euphemisms that sailors used when contemplating their own mortality. "If it gets bad," Ratter had said, "I figure we've got maybe 10 minutes before something finds us." Delowski had responded with dark humor. 10 minutes? You're an optimist." At 8:02 in the morning, the first wave appeared. 4 Nakajima Ki 43 Hayabusa fighters, what the Americans called Oscars, coming in fast and low from the west. The Laffey's 5-inch guns opened fire at 7,000 yards, throwing up curtains of black smoke as the proximity-fused shells detonated. The 40mm Bofors joined in at 4,000 yards, their distinctive pom-pom-pom rhythm adding to the cacophony. The 20mm guns held their fire, waiting for the enemy to enter their envelope. The lead Oscar began its dive at 2,000 yards. Johnson tracked it through his ring sight, waiting for Commander Becton's fire control officer to give the command. 1,500 yards, 1,000 yards, 800 yards. Now. Commence firing. The Oerlikon bucked against Johnson's shoulder as the first rounds left the barrel. The gun's recoil was substantial. Roughly 1 ton of force generated 450 times per minute. But the weapon's spring-loaded mounting system absorbed most of the shock. What it could not absorb was the concussion, the brain-rattling impact of high-explosive shells detonating mere feet from the gunner's unprotected head. Johnson walked his fire into the diving Oscar, watching his tracers arc upward in a glowing stream. The incendiary rounds found their mark at 600 yards. The Oscar's engine cowling erupted in flames. The aircraft shuddered, veered left, and plunged into the ocean 400 yards from the Laffey's port beam. The crew barely had time to register the victory before the next attacker appeared. The mathematics of anti-aircraft defense during World War II favored the attacker overwhelmingly. Studies conducted after the war revealed that, on average, it required approximately 1,800 rounds of 20mm ammunition to achieve a single aircraft elimination. The 40mm Bofors was more efficient, roughly 800 rounds per confirmed target destroyed, but still required sustained, accurate fire. The 5-inch guns, while devastating when they connected, struggled to track fast-moving aircraft at close range. What this meant in practical terms was that a single destroyer, even one as heavily armed as the Laffey, could not possibly defeat a sustained, coordinated attack by dozens of aircraft. The ship's magazines held finite ammunition. The gun barrels would overheat. The crews would exhaust themselves. Eventually, something would penetrate the defensive screen, and when it did, The ship would suffer catastrophic damage. Commander Beckton understood this calculus perfectly. His job was not to achieve the impossible, stopping every attacker, but rather to inflict enough damage, create enough chaos, and maintain enough defensive fire to reduce the number of successful hits. If the Laffey could survive long enough for support to arrive, or for the Japanese to exhaust their attack force, the ship might make it home. Might. At 8:27, the second wave arrived. 9 aircraft this time, a mixed formation of Aichi D-3A VAL dive bombers and Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. They came from multiple directions simultaneously. A coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the destroyer's fire control systems. The Laffey's guns engaged all targets within range, creating a dome of explosive fire around the ship. But 9 attackers against 1 ship meant that some would inevitably break through. Johnson's gun crew tracked a Zero coming in from the stern quarter, low and fast. The fighter was flying barely 30 feet above the wavetops, using the ocean's surface to mask its approach from the ship's fire control radar. By the time the Laffey's lookout spotted it, the Zero was already within 1,500 yards, dangerously close. Johnson swung his Oerlikon onto target and opened fire without waiting for orders. The 20-millimeter rounds walked toward the Zero, tracers marking their path like deadly fireflies. The Japanese pilot, recognizing that he had been acquired, pulled up sharply and began his attack run. He was coming directly at Johnson's gun position. This was the moment that separated survivors from casualties. Standard Navy doctrine dictated that gun crews should take cover when an aircraft entered its final dive toward their position. The theory was sound. Better to preserve the crew for the next engagement than lose them defending a gun that could not realistically stop a determined attacker from 300 yards. But Johnson and his crew had made a different calculation. They stayed on the gun. Johnson kept firing as the Zero grew larger in his sight picture. 500 yards, 400 yards, 300 yards. He could see the rising sun painted on the wings, could see the propeller blur, could see individual rivets in the aluminum skin. The Zero's fuselage was walking with hits, his hits, but the aircraft kept coming. 200 yards, 100 yards. The Japanese pilot's face was visible now, leather helmet, goggles, expression of absolute determination. At 75 yards, the Zero's engine exploded. Not a small fire, not a leak, a catastrophic detonation that tore the entire power plant from its mounts. The aircraft pitched nose down violently, slammed into the ocean, and cartwheeled in a spray of burning fuel and disintegrating metal. Pieces of the aircraft passed within 20 yards of Johnson's gun mount. The heat from the fireball was intense enough to blister the paint on the Laffey's stern. Johnson did not celebrate. Rader was already traversing the gun to the next target. Delowski was swapping out the empty magazine for a fresh 60-round drum. Clower was feeding the next magazine into position. The entire reload took 6 seconds. They were firing again before the Zero's wreckage had finished sinking. The battle intensified. At 8:39, a VAL dive bomber struck the Laffey's after 5-inch gun mount, the aircraft's 500-pound bomb detonating inside the turret. The explosion wiped out the entire gun crew, 11 men, in an instant. Fire erupted from the shattered turret, sending black smoke billowing across the fantail. The ship's damage control parties raced to contain the blaze, while the remaining guns continued firing. Johnson's position was now in the direct path of the smoke. Visibility dropped to near zero. The acrid smell of burning paint, fuel, and worse things filled his lungs. But stopping meant death. For him, for his crew, for the ship. He continued firing on sound and instinct, tracking targets he could barely see through the smoke, relying on the tracers to guide his aim. At 8:44, the third wave arrived. 6 aircraft, then 8, then 12. Commander Beckton stopped trying to count them. The Laffey had become the center of an aerial firestorm, with Japanese aircraft attacking from every point of the compass simultaneously. The 5-inch guns were firing so rapidly that their barrels glowed red. The 40-millimeter Bofors were consuming ammunition at twice their rated sustained fire rate, the gun crews ignoring overheating warnings. The 20-millimeter Oerlikons fired continuously, their distinctive ripping sound blending into a sustained roar. Johnson's crew was operating beyond the limits of human endurance. They had been firing for 37 minutes without pause. The Oerlikon's barrel was so hot that it was beginning to droop slightly, affecting accuracy. Johnson's shoulders were bruised and bleeding from the continuous recoil. Ratter's hands were blistered from gripping the hot traverse wheel. Dulowski and Cloer were moving like automatons, their movements mechanical, driven by training and adrenaline rather than conscious thought. Then Johnson saw it. A Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber coming in from the port quarter at a steep angle. This was not a standard attack run. The Judy was coming almost vertically, diving from 8,000 feet at terminal velocity. At that angle and speed, it would be nearly impossible to hit. But Johnson made a decision that violated every principle of anti-aircraft gunnery he had been taught. Instead of tracking the aircraft with continuous fire, he calculated its trajectory, where it would be rather than where it was, and laid down a barrage pattern ahead of the dive path. He was essentially creating a cloud of exploding shells through which the Judy would have to fly. It was a technique called barrage fire, and it was explicitly forbidden for individual 20-millimeter guns because it wasted ammunition and reduced hit probability. Johnson did it anyway. He fired a 4-second burst, 30 rounds, into empty air 300 feet ahead of the diving Judy. Then he waited. 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The Judy entered his barrage zone at 420 miles per hour. The results were spectacular. The Judy flew directly into Johnson's pre-positioned shell pattern. Multiple 20-millimeter high-explosive incendiary rounds detonated against the aircraft's nose, canopy, and engine. The bomber's airframe, already stressed to its structural limits by the near-vertical dive, simply came apart. The wings separated. The fuselage broke in two. The 500-pound bomb broke loose and tumbled free, detonating in the water 200 yards from the ship. For a brief moment, the nearby gun crews stopped firing and stared at Johnson's position. What he had just done was theoretically impossible, shooting down a diving aircraft by pre-positioning fire rather than tracking. It was the gunnery equivalent of a trick shot, except the stakes were survival. Commander Beckton, watching from the bridge, grabbed the intercom. "Gun 22, excellent shooting. All Oerlikon mounts, you are authorized to engage using barrage fire at crew discretion." He had just given official approval to a forbidden technique because it worked. The battle continued with unrelenting intensity. At 8:51, a Zero struck the Laffey's forward gun director, wiping out the fire control crew and destroying the ship's ability to coordinate its 5-inch guns. The turrets switched to local control, each gun captain selecting and engaging targets independently. Accuracy dropped, but volume of fire remained high. At 8:58, a Zero carrying a 250-kilogram bomb struck the Laffey amidships, the aircraft and its ordnance detonating against the forward funnel. The explosion tore a 20-foot hole in the deck and started massive fires in the forward engine room. The ship's speed dropped from 25 knots to 15 as one of the boilers went offline. At 9:04, another kamikaze struck the after-deck house, its bomb penetrating 2 decks before detonating. The blast severed the ship's steering cables and destroyed the aft steering compartment. The Laffey could no longer turn. Commander Beckton ordered emergency steering from the engine room, but the response was agonizingly slow. The ship was now a barely maneuverable burning target. Johnson's gun crew kept firing. They had been in continuous combat for 62 minutes. Their Oerlikon had fired approximately 27,000 rounds, roughly 450 drums of ammunition. The barrel was so worn that accuracy had degraded by an estimated 30%. Johnson compensated by moving his aim point closer, engaging targets at ranges that would have been considered suicidal earlier in the battle. At 9:12, a Val dive bomber began its attack run directly toward Johnson's gun mount. This was the scenario every Oerlikon crew feared, a determined attacker coming straight at them with the clear intention of eliminating their gun position. Navy doctrine was unambiguous. Take cover. Let the other guns handle it. Preserve the crew. Johnson's crew stayed on the gun. They fired continuously as the Val descended. Johnson could see every detail of the aircraft, the fixed landing gear, the greenhouse canopy, the single 7.7mm machine gun in the rear cockpit firing back at him. The Japanese rear gunners' bullets were stitching the deck around Johnson's position, sparking off metal, ricocheting with distinctive whines. Johnson ignored them. He kept his sight picture centered on the Val's engine cowling and held the trigger down. 500 yards, 400, 300. His rounds were hitting. He could see the impacts. But the Val was still flying, still diving, still coming. 200 yards. The Val's bomb was visible now, suspended beneath the fuselage. 100 yards. The Japanese pilot released the bomb. It was coming directly at Johnson. At 70 yards, Johnson's continuous fire finally achieved critical effect. The Val's engine seized completely, the propeller freezing in mid-rotation. The aircraft pitched nose down sharply, passing less than 15 feet over Johnson's gun mount. The wind from its passage was strong enough to knock Dolewski off his feet. The Val crashed into the ocean 30 yards beyond the Laffey's stern. The bomb missed. It passed 10 feet to the left of Johnson's gun position, struck the water, and sank without detonating. It was a dud. Johnson slumped against his gun mount, gasping for air. His vision was tunneling. His ears were ringing so badly that he could barely hear the continuing battle around him. Ratter grabbed his shoulder and shook him. "We're still in it. Stay with us." Johnson nodded, straightened, and returned to his gun. By 9:27, the Laffey had been struck by 6 kamikaze aircraft and hit by 4 bombs. The ship was on fire from bow to stern. The forward 5-inch guns were destroyed. The after 5-inch mount was a smoking crater. Half the 40mm guns were out of action. The ship was listing 7 degrees to port and had lost steering control. Casualty reports were coming in from every section of the ship, but the Laffey was still fighting. The surviving gun crews, many of them wounded, continued to engage every aircraft within range. Johnson's 20mm crew had been firing for 76 minutes straight. They had expended every drum of ready ammunition at their position and were now using reserves carried up from below decks by damage control parties. At 9:31, the Japanese attack ended as suddenly as it had begun. The surviving aircraft turned north and disappeared into the haze. Silence descended on the Laffey. Not true silence, but the absence of incoming fire. The ship's guns fell quiet one by one as their crews confirmed there were no more targets. Johnson released his grip on the Oerlikon's handles and looked around. The aft section of the ship was almost unrecognizable. The deck was torn and twisted. The superstructure was holed in a dozen places. Fires burned everywhere. Bodies lay where they had fallen. The ship was barely floating, but it was floating. Against all odds, despite 6 direct kamikaze hits and 4 bomb strikes, despite losing 103 crew members with another 72 wounded, despite fires in 5 separate compartments and no working steering, the USS Laffey had survived. Commander Becton appeared on the fantail, his uniform torn and blackened, a bandage on his forehead. He walked among the surviving gun crews, shaking hands, speaking quietly to each man. When he reached Johnson's position, he stopped and studied the 4 sailors who were still standing at their gun. "How many did you get, son?" Becton asked. Johnson looked at his gun, at the pile of empty ammunition drums surrounding his position, at his crew. "I don't know, sir. We just kept firing." Becton nodded. The Combat Air Patrol counted 17 confirmed aircraft eliminations attributed to this ship's defensive fire. Your gun position is credited with at least 5, possibly 7. That barrage fire technique you used, where did you learn that? "I didn't, sir. I just figured it might work." "It did work. It worked well enough that I authorized all guns to use it. You probably saved this ship." Becton paused, then added quietly, "You were supposed to take cover when that last one came at you. You know that, right?" "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you?" Johnson looked at Rader, at Delowski, at Clower. Then he looked back at Commander Becton. "Because if we left the guns, sir, there wouldn't be anyone to stop them, and they had to be stopped." Becton was silent for a moment. Then he saluted. Johnson, exhausted and wounded, saluted back. The USS Laffey's survival off Okinawa on April 16, 1945, became legendary within the U.S. Navy. The ship's ability to absorb catastrophic damage and continue fighting defied every expectation of what a destroyer could endure. Naval architects studying the wreckage later concluded that the Laffey should have sunk 3 times over based on the damage it sustained, but it didn't sink. It was towed to Keramaretto for emergency repairs, then sailed to Seattle for extensive rebuilding. The ship returned to service in 1946 and served until 1975, when it was decommissioned and eventually became a museum ship at Patriots Point in South Carolina. The gun crews who fought that morning, particularly those who remained at their exposed positions despite direct attacks, represented something fundamental about American naval personnel in World War II. They were not professional warriors. Johnson had been a farm equipment mechanic in Iowa before the war. Rader had worked in his family's grocery store. Delowski had been a factory worker. Clower had been unemployed. But when their ship needed them to stand and fight in a position that offered no protection, no realistic chance of survival, and no reward beyond knowing they had done their duty, they stood. They fought with damaged equipment, dwindling ammunition, and injuries that would have incapacitated lesser men. They improvised forbidden techniques when standard procedures failed, and they refused to abandon their posts even when survival meant running. The barrage fire technique Johnson pioneered that morning, pre-positioning anti-aircraft fire ahead of a target's trajectory rather than tracking continuously, was later studied by naval ordnance and incorporated into anti-aircraft doctrine. What had been a desperate improvisation became standard procedure for engaging high-speed diving targets. The Japanese High Command, reviewing reports from Kikusui No. 6, noted that the Laffey had survived attacks that should have destroyed it multiple times. They attributed this to unexpectedly effective defensive fire from all gun positions and failure of attack aircraft to neutralize anti-aircraft batteries. What they did not understand was that American gun crews simply refused to be neutralized. The concept of staying at your post when doing so meant almost certain elimination was incomprehensible within Japanese tactical doctrine, which emphasized coordinated sacrifice but not individual last stands. Commander Becton received the Navy Cross for his leadership during the battle. Johnson received the Silver Star. Rader, Delowski, and Clower received Bronze Stars. The citations noted their extraordinary heroism and disregard for personal safety in the face of overwhelming enemy attack. The medals were presented in a ceremony aboard the repaired Laffey in Seattle 6 months after the battle. Decades later, in 1988, Johnson was interviewed for a naval history project documenting the Okinawa campaign. The interviewer asked him what he remembered most clearly about that morning. Johnson was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The sound. The Oerlikon makes this sound when it fires, kind of a ripping noise like tearing metal. After a while you don't really hear it anymore because it's constant. But when it stops, when you finally stop firing, the silence is deafening. That silence meant we were still alive. That's what I remember. The silence at the end that meant we'd made it." The interviewer asked if he would do it again, knowing what he knew now about the odds, about the danger, about the fact that standard doctrine said he should have taken cover. Johnson's answer was immediate. "In a heartbeat. That was my gun. That was my ship. Those were my shipmates. You don't abandon your post. You don't abandon your people. You stand and fight even when the math says you're going to lose. Sometimes, if you fight hard enough, the math is wrong." The USS Laffey stands today as a museum ship, its decks walked by thousands of visitors annually who come to see the ship that would not die. The 20mm gun mount where Johnson and his crew made their stand has been restored and preserved. A plaque nearby tells the story of that 80-minute battle and the crew that refused to surrender their gun. The plaque does not mention that what they did violated Navy doctrine. It does not mention that they should have taken cover. It does not mention that the barrage fire technique was forbidden. It simply states the facts. 1-gun crew, 4 men, 80 minutes of continuous combat, at least 7 enemy aircraft eliminated, 0 men who abandoned their post. Sometimes the most important rules are the ones that warriors break when survival demands it. Sometimes the difference between defeat and victory is measured not in firepower or technology, but in the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when their ship, their crew, and their country need them most. On April 16, 1945, Robert Johnson and his gun crew stood at their post when survival meant running. They fired when doctrine said they should take cover. They improvised when standard procedures failed. And they helped save the USS Laffey by refusing to accept that the mathematics of destruction applied to them. The ship that would not perish earned its nickname that day. But it was the sailors who would not quit. The farm equipment mechanic, the grocery clerk, the factory worker, and the unemployed dreamer who made that survival possible. Their Oerlikon cannon spoke for 80 minutes with a voice that said, "Not today, not this ship, not while we still have ammunition." And when the silence finally came, when the guns fell quiet and the smoke cleared, the Laffey was still afloat, still fighting, still refusing to surrender to the mathematics of war. That is the story of how one gun crew's forbidden technique and suicidal stand helped achieve the impossible, not because they were superhuman, but because they were sailors who understood that some posts are worth holding regardless of the odds. The thunder of their guns has faded into history, but the lesson remains. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is standing at your gun when every instinct screams to run and firing until the battle is won or the ammunition is gone. On April 16, 1945, the ammunition didn't run out first. The enemy did.